Okay, I think we can kick off today's presentation. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Business School Alumni Angels webinar series. My name is Jean Kovacs, and I'm co-chair of the HBS Alumni Angels. And now it gives me truly great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Michael Eckhardt. I should say that Michael and I graduated the same year from HBS, which I won't mention the number, but we go back a long time, and it's really exciting for me personally to see classmates as they go forward and do exciting things with their career and in the world. And certainly Michael is one of the exemplary models of that. Michael is Managing Director and Senior Workshop Leader at the Chasm Institute. Now, many of us have directly benefited from the methodologies that the Chasm Institute introduced several years ago when they published their highly acclaimed book, Crossing the Chasm. I actually went and pulled my copy out of my bookshelf. It was printed in 1991. So this methodology and thinking really changed the way that people view business. At the Chasm Institute and in the industry, Michael is a recognized expert in leading one-day and two-day marketing strategy workshops and specific client outcome, which is accelerating growth for their technology-based clients and services in the next 12 to 24 months. His client base includes many companies that we've heard of: Cisco, Adobe, Hewlett-Packard, Autodesk, Intel, AT&T Wireless, and dozens of other tech companies worldwide. In his practice, Michael provides working sessions and predictive tools that help technology clients achieve growth in their most challenging markets. And as you can imagine, during the pandemic, this has become absolutely critical as companies deal with the new dynamics of their market. And that is why we are so grateful for Michael to take the time today and condense some of these learnings into less than an hour. Now, I don't want to take any additional time before we let Michael speak, but I did want to mention, if you have questions, please go to the bottom of your screen and type them, click on the Q&A box, and you can enter them in there. We may take a break during this talk to get to some of the questions, so feel free to type them in as Michael's presenting. If not, we have allocated time at the end of his presentation, and we will specifically then go into the Q&A. So again, thank you, Michael, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jean. Let me just pull it up right now and we'll get going. Super. All right, well, hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Some of you are very brave people in other parts of the world, different time zones on this, having not just morning coffee, but maybe an evening dinner or even past that. I want to welcome you to what Jean's doing describing. The Angels are doing such important and interesting work, and the HBS Alumni Group is really part of that major fundamental area. And so what we're going to hit today, and I hope it works from a practicality standpoint, really clear, practical, kind of pressure-tested ways of getting through some tough times. And I don't think we need to elaborate on the fact that these are tough times right now with what we're establishing and experiencing. So in the next 55 minutes, it's going to be casual. It'll be me presenting, but also a conversation with Jean, and also questions coming in from you on the Q&A. So we want to make this high impact and also interesting to each of you as you go through your work and your pressures and your day-to-day efforts. So the title of this is Launching Tech Products in Tough Economic Times. This is not the first tough time. We've done some studies on over 100 companies of what they do when things get tough, when markets drop, when economies shrink, and so forth in the tech field, particularly in the venture field, but also new products and larger companies. And so what we're going to do is really pinpoint from the work we've done with over 225 clients, all in the tech space or disruptive space, and really talk through what you can do in the next 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months to really prepare your business, your new venture or your new product line to be successful. And so what I promise you is we're not going to go throw a lot of theory at you. It's going to be fundamentally it's going to be what we're going to talk about is frameworks, tools, and real examples from the real world, not the sample world. And so the whole idea is, how do you scale and grow when markets are not cooperating properly? Jean mentioned the Crossing the Chasm book. We just updated it in the last year. It's the 2019 2020 version. We'll talk later if you want to get a free copy of the electronic version of the first 4 chapters. We'll be happy to get that to you. But this session is not about the book. It's really about meaningful ways to go forth in your business. And if we think about the economic downturns that you've really been experiencing, it's not the first one. In fact, if we talked about market downturns and tough times, there's at least 3 of them that many of you are experiencing. If you're really on the younger side, the tech bubble of 2004, you were in high school or maybe before that, but that was a major, we'll call it a collapse in the market, in funding, in venture capital, in all sorts of new ventures. The 2007 to 2011, this is with Lehman Brothers and the experiences there, and then the aftermath, and of course what we're going through now. The key lesson, and you're going to see this framed in those 3 questions that I not just ask you to, but actually beg you to think about before launch of anything coming out in this tough and difficult market, is the following. And that is that of the 110 companies that we studied and tracked, those that survived, those that thrived, and also those that failed during these tougher times, one very fundamental lesson learned that we're going to drill down on and tap into is that going broader and going more horizontal and doing something, and I'm going to throw a technical term at you here, spray and pray, is trying to get desperate and broad is the opposite of success. That actually in tough times, what we've seen is that greater market focus, not less, is actually the antidote to winning. It's almost counterintuitive that you send your sales force out, you send your marketing teams out, you go, hey, anything with a pulse and $50,000 is a customer for us. That's not the right way to approach a tough time. In fact, if you drill down on this and click on the times of greater focus required, and we're going to come back to the questions in a minute on this regarding what it really takes to answer before the product launch, is it turns out there's actually 5 sub-clicks on what we mean by greater market focus. The first one is target specific market and customer segment use cases that cannot be put off, where people don't say, hey, you know what, we love that new cybersecurity solution, or we love that new solar solution, but we'll come back in 2022 when things are better. No, this is about what's urgent and painful today, not what can be deferred. Second, be decisive about who you're not going to serve. Every strategy that, whether it's Jean Kovacs with her business and Hilvan and the work that she does on the investment side, or what we do at Chasm, we expect people to tell us who you're targeting, but also who you're not going to go after. And it turns out that we would expect you to cross out target markets that 6 months ago, before COVID, you would have probably said, we can go after those two, and also those. Example, on the cybersecurity side, we had a client who 6 months ago was going after healthcare, was going after finance, and going after other key segment areas. They've now focused on healthcare only. That is their specific segment. And now you're saying, hey, in this crisis, Michael, isn't that dangerous to go narrow? No, it's actually dangerous to go broad. We'll give you evidence of that in a few minutes. Third is avoid what we call the segment of the month club, where every month you pivot based on the last meeting you had, the last sales encounter, the last investor meeting. There's no time to waste in a crisis. And if you're old enough to remember the book of the month club, you also want to avoid the segment of the month club where you pivot from financial to healthcare to entertainment to oil and gas within a 4-month period. Why? At some point, not only will you be confused, but you need to actually be clear that your sales team, your marketing team, your R&D team has to be actually settled in the right segment strategy. And by the way, a tip we're going to give you in a few minutes on this is that picking the right segment, turns out it's really important to stay with it, but also to pick the right one in the first place. And we're going to show you that for most young ventures and other companies who are trying to succeed, the issue of using TAM as your major metric, the total addressable market, is an error, especially in tough times. Your goal is TAM long term, but short term is what can you dominate, what can you win in, what can you actually drive success in specifically to solve a real problem. And that's the goal. And so this disease about segment of the month is really dangerous. We're going to actually give you later in this session 9 key factors that actually help predict to an 80% level of certainty whether you've got the right segment, the right target application, the right problem to be solved. It's not perfect, but it gives you about an 80% certainty, and it's based on our analytics at Chasm Institute, over the last 15 or more years, but particularly during those 3 crisis areas. And then the other two key down clicks on this about lessons learned is focus is not enough. You need to commit to what we call a minimum viable whole product. And by minimum viable whole product, we mean not just do you have the core product, but do you have all the important enablers around it. We'll come back to this later, but do you have a proven, pressure-tested solution that's not just the core technology, but also the other hardware perhaps required, or the application software, or the connectivity, or the legacy systems. And these are not just 8 slices. It's typically 15 to 25 elements. We'll come back to this later on, but basically we see way too many companies fail because they focused on product instead of whole product. That's not a very good idea. And then lastly, the idea that if you're going to execute and build and succeed, a realistic plan, because we see lots of unrealistic plans, a tightly focused, what we call 9-point strategy for going to market. And you'll see that in a few minutes. We won't hold it back as a mystery, but it really, in our books, in our work with 225 companies, it's basically the navigational North Star for how are you going to win and how are you going to actually take revenue growth and customer loyalty and take it to a new level. So, in review, whether you're in the crisis mode of 20 years ago or the Lehman collapse or today in the COVID-19, the idea is, and the meta theme is, greater market focus, more discipline, not less. Counterintuitive perhaps, but we got proof points based on the 110 companies that we've looked at in this particular set of domains. And so take that away as I hope, and feel free later to send some email questions and so forth, but those are really the precursors, the preamble to the 3 questions we're going to address. And if you can do that right, then the 3 questions that are going to come up here, that I'm just going to foreshadow for a minute, are a where question, a which question, and a how question. And they're going to differ depending on who you are and what market you're in. But let's be really clear about something. And I got I'd say about 20 emails, Gene, ahead of time from people who are attending the webinar. Half of them are from new young ventures or the founders or the investors in those ventures. The other half are from larger tech companies who are also launching products. And they say, hey, what can we learn from these 3 questions? We're going to address both areas, both the young, new ventures, as well as the more larger companies that are also looking to launch. So we can hit kind of both and really talk about what's different in each one of those 2 buckets. But first, before we say about that, a couple quick things. One is, we're not going to focus on the large enterprise clients that we at Chasm, and we've been around for more than 15 years, are actually focused on. But we will look at more of what we call the emerging growth clients. Those that really have levels of drive and levels of near-term, what we'll call wanting either to become a unicorn or have become one in some cases. You'll see on the left-hand side companies like Workspan and Nest, who was a startup now obviously acquired by Google. Spotify is a client of ours. We wish we could claim credit for their amazing success. They did very well before we ever got to work with them. But just as a reference point, Spotify has just now, despite these tough times, hit their 130 millionth, not customer, but paid customer or paying customer, current. And those customers are each paying right around $9.99 a month. Yeah, there's family plans and student plans. That $9.99, whether it's in dollars or in euros, if you do the math on 130, that's over about $1 billion in cash flow a month. Now, that was a startup. And what they've learned in the last 3 years, but more importantly, the last 6 months, is to focus even more clearly on their target segments and not just spray music streaming across the globe. But we're going to take the lessons from all those and the learnings and apply those specifically based on everything we've seen to those 3 questions that we want to hit on: the where, the which, and the how. So let's drill down on those now. And then as questions come in, Gene, we can certainly have them asked. If we want to hold off towards the end of the webinar for questions, of course, that's fine too. The first one, and if we're going to really succeed in a tough economic time like this, I'm going to use the F word a couple times, okay? I hope that's okay with you. Now, the F word I'm talking about is the word focus, not the other F word. But this F word is actually easy to say and hard to do. How do you actually focus properly in the right segments, the right target accounts, and so forth? And so it turns out that the focus is really first off predicated by, do you know where you're actually competing on the tech market model? Do we know? And please don't tell me, hey, we're a startup, we must be an early market. That's not an incorrect association with this. In fact, it's a great misunderstanding. The second question is, which opportunity, which segment should we attack? And by definition, as you just heard me say, even which target segment should we not go after now? Maybe hit the stop button or the pause button. We just worked with a solar company who's working on solar technology, and they told us 9 months ago, hey, we're working on industrial solar, commercial solar for office buildings, and residential solar. And it turns out that was all realistic before COVID. And now they basically tripled down in one segment on industrial because they scored using our tool set which segment is better. And that gave them hope and realism that there's one segment. And the other two, they're not going to throw them away, but they're going to actually pause, hit the pause button on those. And then third, if we're going to execute on the segment we're going after, what does it take to actually win? And this is where the 9 points come in. Now, you'll hear more about this later in the webinar, but it turns out these 9 points, everything from point 1, which is around the target market decision, to what we call compelling reason to buy, like why should somebody actually buy a new cloud-based solution versus the old on-prem, or go to from traditional to 3D printing, or go to an AI-based solution, when in fact the manual one seems to be working okay. That's all about compelling reason to buy. I'm not going to go through this list right now, but later on you'll see that these are actually the 9 key areas. They're actually the 9 key areas. We're going to call them points of failure that for young companies or for new product lines coming out for more established companies, these are the 9 ways, and excuse my French here on this or my colloquial, but it's the 9 ways to fail. It's the 9 ways to screw it up. Many of you in venture, in new companies, whether as an investor or an LP or a founder, it turns out there's not 100 ways to screw it up when a young company goes to market or when you product launch a new product from an established business. There's actually only 9. And if we have the target market wrong and the problem or pain point wrong or the whole product wrong or the partners wrong, et cetera, that's how we fail. So think of it this way. It's the points of failure if we get them wrong, and it's actually the 9 points of success. Let's focus on positive if we get them right. And that's where a Spotify or a Nest or some of the key cybersecurity companies we work with or the 3D printing that we work with or others in the new venture area really grasp onto this. Those of you today in this webinar, you're a smart, wise group, probably with experience. Maybe this is your first or second or fifth company and new venture that you've been involved in. And I hope what you see is that there's a resonance around the where question, the which question, and the how question. And if we can get those deeper and well defined and answered, not just by the CEO, but by the entire executive team, that you all have alignment, then you've got a chance of actually winning in your market. So that really comes out to an element of focus around those 3 questions and what we really need to accomplish. So let's drill down just for a moment on that first question, which is it sounds theoretical, but it's not. It's actually about the where question, which is how do we actually engage and win in a particular segment, and where are we today when it comes to where we're competing? And so I'm going to throw you a slide. It's a fairly busy slide, so I'll do the build right now. This is called the headache slide. It's a little bit more information that's really supposed to be on a PowerPoint. But basically, it turns out that there's key patterns around how new innovations, whether AI, machine learning, 3D printing, cybersecurity, how those get adopted. And this thing we call the tech market model, which is an updated version in our newest book of what we've done before, is really about how customers decide to buy, when they reject your offer, and so forth. And so an important part of this, and Gene, you and I have talked about this before, is when we talk about the where question, be really careful that if you start thinking about that from an internal standpoint, and you might say, well, Michael, it's not so hard. We're in the early market. How do we know that? Because our product's only 50% done. We can't be anywhere else. And the answer is wrong. On the game shows, you would get the buzzer. It doesn't matter how far along your product is. The question is, where's the category today? And keep in mind, the early adopter and early market is really made up of only about 5 to 8% of customers. These are not the normal customers. These are the visionaries, the pioneers, the early adopters who are willing to buy before you have a whole complete solution. But here's the danger. If you tell me that you're an early market, when in fact, it turns out that the category you're competing in is actually further along, then there's a danger of you missing the train, missing the bus, missing the trip out into the major marketplace. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Spotify before in music streaming. Today, Apple and Spotify in music streaming share the worldwide market about 50-50. Yeah, Pandora and others are playing in that space as well, certainly. But the idea is Apple and Spotify each have about 40% share in the worldwide market. It differs by age, it differs by geography, et cetera. If you have a friend who currently is in the garage with two other people starting a music streaming business and they say, Michael, we are right now an early market because we have a better music streaming solution. It's better than Spotify, it's better than Apple. We're going to launch it in 2021, but we're only 50% done, so we must be an early market. The answer is, sorry, you're not an early market. You've missed that train, you've missed that bus. You're actually here, and you're not enjoying that market. You are not in an early market. Why? Because the marketplace would put you further along. So be really careful about thinking about at your own navel level, contemplating your navel and saying, where are we? We're not ready to launch. Nobody cares, maybe except your mother, your father, and your family about whether you think you're in the early market or not. The rest of the market puts you somewhere else. The other issue that comes up a lot, and we'll see this happen, is when there's discussions around we're an A round company or a B round company or C, or we're an angel invested company. That is not a market metric. And I'm going to be a little controversial here. At a cocktail party, somebody might say, well, we're a B round, and we're really happy about that. We've been very successful. The danger is that an A or B or C round investment is a great element or a great factor in terms of funding metric success, funding metric. It has nothing to do with how far along you are on what we call the tech market model. There's fundamentally the question, you can be an A round company and be late to market here, and your marketplace is actually taking off over here, and you better catch up. Or you might be a C round in the same way. So think of it that A, B, and C, angel investing, friends and family, et cetera, that's an important metric from a funding success standpoint. Congratulations on getting that next round of 5 million or 50 million. But that is not correlated with where you are in the adoption curve. It's a market metric that we have to get to. And so what I'm going to do is give you 15 seconds right now, not more, because we're limited in time. And I'll be quiet for 15 seconds while you look at this and take a look at what the blue descriptors are for each one of those stages. That'll set the basis for the rest of the webinar in terms of what we're going to cover. I'll be quiet for those 14 seconds now. Okay, that was a quick 14 seconds. Let's be clear that for many of you that are on the younger side in terms of venture, you may be here. This is not the easy part, but this is the easier part where you're finding customers who are as excited about your product as you are. That's pretty cool. That's 5 to 8% of the market. But the real goal to scale is actually not that group. The real goal is the 90% of the market that's sitting over here. We call them the pragmatists, the conservatives, you know, the normal customers. And it turns out that everywhere along here, we've got a challenge that differs from the prior stage. Even the element of your sales force and how you go about it. Notice, and I'll take the circle away so we can actually see the description here, is that in what we call bowling alley that we'll describe in a minute, it's actually a highly focused set of demand and not everybody can sell there. About 1 out of 6 sales reps are successful because they have a skill called what? Called consultative selling. They can actually solve for a problem, not the transactional selling that normal sales reps do in the mature market. So if you hire people in, make sure they've had consultative selling, not just transactional selling, because that's not a key element of the early stages. What we'll see as we go through this is that as you go through the A, B, and C rounds, you may be maturing in context of where you're trying to accomplish things, and that certainly is a good thing. But when you think about the span of where we are, those first 3 stages are the fundamental ones that matter. And so whether you're, and let's just take a look at the possible levels, because I got a lot of emails, like I said, about 20 of them before the session. You're represented by a lot of what we see on this page. You know, the next $1 trillion in revenue. It was going to be more than that, but basically the pandemic has helped knock that down a bit. But in the next 12 to 24 months, there's still growth. You know, Salesforce is still growing, and many other companies as well. And so these 9 tech trends, I'm hoping that you see yourselves in one of these 9 or on this list over here. You're probably representing in one of these areas, whether it's blockchain, whether it's SaaS, advanced apps, whether it's big data, whether it's security and privacy, whatever it may be. And it turns out that of those 3 questions that we're going to have you think about and act on and execute on, it turns out that if we get the first one wrong, we're going to pull the wrong levels, we're going to actually hire the wrong people, and we're going to have the wrong go-to-market strategy. And so let's start and go a little deeper into what that question actually entails. And by that, what we're describing is the element of where are we competing on the tech market model, not as a theoretical question, not to make me happy, but really to make you and your team and your funders and your LPs and your investors and your corporate, if it's a larger company, actually happy with the results of what's happening. And so if we take that question and go one step further into where we are, it turns out that fundamentally, everything we do around this tech market model helps drive what? Our decisions around what should we do and not do. It talks about things like what features should we add in? What channel do we actually invest in? How we price the product? What is our messaging? These all vary. Even pricing. Be careful on the pricing strategy. You're going to see a rectangle here, and we call this the rectangle of death. It's actually the rectangle of price inelasticity that says, and we'll define these terms in a few minutes, what chasm really is, what bowling alley really is. These are buzzwords, but we've used them and described them in our books in a way that really breaks it out and makes it come alive. That if you're beyond the early market, but you have not yet commercialized into the main marketplace, and somebody in your meeting goes, I got a good idea. Let's drop price by 10 or 12% because that always drives demand. And the answer is, if you're in this area of late early market or chasm crossing, where you haven't yet sold to the normal customer yet, and your first most clever idea is to cut price by 12%, try another strategy. Because what we're going to see is that the term, and some of you remember this from business school, of price elasticity, is not of equal power in different levels of the life cycle. In terms of price elasticity in a mature market, if you take a Toyota Prius, a hybrid electric gas car, and drop price by 12%, you're going to see a nice uptick in sales. If you have a product in the chasm over here, or near it, and you drop price by 12%, you will see a lack of price elasticity, actually about 0. Now, you need to have a normal, good price, excuse me, but if you go higher or lower than that, you're not going to help yourselves. Why? In this area here, you need a good price, but if you drop price, you'll see nothing happen. Well, you'll see something happen. You'll basically see margin erode, but what we need to do is focus on a price point that actually gets customers to move across and buy. Turns out even a free product can get stuck in the chasm. If you remember Linux from years ago, Linux was free as an alternative OS based on a lot of technology from earlier predecessor technologies on Unix and so forth. Unix moved into the elements later and the key technologies around Linux, and that actually got stuck in the chasm for 3 years, even though it was a free product. Why? Because this is not about free, this is about risk. The risk of change, the risk of swap out, the risk of adoption. And so as we take this through and think about the premise, the question I want to ask you before we move on is really, where are you today? Where are you actually competing on what we call the tech market model today? And so I'd like you to personalize this to your own question about looking at Q3 of 2020. This is the midsummer time period. And if we can get clarity about that, a couple things happen. You'll get greater certainty and less risk about where you're going and also what we should and should not be doing. So I wish I could give you a little pill that would actually answer this question for you, but it requires your customer understanding, your customer centricity, your thoughtfulness about how customers' problems actually emerge. And so let's take these first three and actually define these terms. The rest of it can wait. You can read that in our books. Some of that will be described in the electronic version of the book that we're happy to send you at no cost, just so you can kind of get into this. We want you to understand and take the newest version of our book and run with it, so we can get that to you later on. But this early market, this chasm, and this bowling alley, what do those really mean? Because they sound like buzzwords, but they actually have a very precise meaning. Early market, that's pretty much a stage where we have those 5 to 8% customers buying. Other people are saying, interesting, but come back next year when COVID is over. Or come back in 3 years after I retire and my next level exec will buy. That's the issue about early market. And early market is when customers are visionaries under the influence of what we call really the early adopters and the technology enthusiasts. Each new deal is greeted with enthusiasm, not by the customer, by you. What? We sold 5 more seats or 50 more seats? Who sold them? Who bought them? What was the price? Where was it? You have a beer bust or a wine party or at least a Zoom cocktail party when you make that sale. Later, if you're in the main marketplace and Salesforce over here sells more licenses, there's no party every time they sell. We always sell that many on a Tuesday at this time. No big deal. But the product is still immature in the early market. In fact, a dirty little secret is it's actually not a product. Early market is actually about project more than product. And what that really implies is that when we think about it, these are projects, meaning they're not plug and play. They require a fair amount of heavy lifting, expertise, and so forth. They will turn into products if you're successful, and in fact, you need to productize them. But in the early going, when you deploy whatever you're doing on AI or machine learning or cyber or other, it's typically project-based and it's highly custom. The other caution on the side of the cigarette pack is watch out for tops-down forecasts. Oh yeah, there's 10,000 medium-sized banks in North America. Why? If we only get 20% of them in the first, be careful. That's what we call crazy tops-down forecast. We suggest a bottoms-up forecast that really looks at the departments, the job titles, et cetera, that you're actually going after. So early market is the easiest part you'll ever have, but it's not easy, we know that. The real challenge comes with when you're done with early market, and now we have what we call the chasm. And the chasm is when you're complete with the early adopters, and now your general manager or your investors or your CEO is asking, when do we start making real money around here? When do we actually scale this thing? But we haven't yet sold to what we call the normalized customer base over here on the right-hand side. And it turns out that the chasm, how long can it last? It can last anywhere from 9 months, and 9 months is really one element of it. It can last from 9 months to how long? To forever. That's a pretty long time. There's categories of technology that were largely promised years ago that never crossed. 9 months to forever is actually the fundamental problem, which is, please, if you do this work, read some of our chapters and decide you're in the chasm, it's not a bad place to be, it's a bad place to get stuck. And it turns out that one of the reasons for the chasm to exist at all is the idea, the element of this is that in the chasm, the pragmatist customers, not the odd customers, but the pragmatists don't yet see evidence of a whole product that would make you a safe buy. They're only seeing the odd companies doing this. I saw this as an example a few months ago where we had a company here in Silicon Valley selling a new artificial learning solution in AI to customers. And they sold to Google, they sold to Facebook, and they sold to a third company I can't mention because they don't want to have that disclosed. And then they went into automotive, and they try to sell to large companies like Toyota and Ford and Volvo. And it turns out those companies, when the references came in from Google and Facebook, they said, that's interesting, but have you got any normal customers to actually buying yet? That's who we need to see is the relevant references. That's what matters deeply in what we're doing. Oh, one other thing I should mention is the key to winning and crossing the chasm and dominating a segment over here is not luck. It's not price cutting. It's what we call 100% whole product. And that 100% whole product, when we really get to that level of detail, means the following. It means 100% of what the customer needs and nothing more, no extraneous features. And it turns out that in chasm crossing, oftentimes your what we call minimum viable product is A, not what you think it should be, it's what the customer's view, their view of the problem to be solved. And B, it may be more about subtracting stuff out. By stuff, I mean features that are just causing more complexity, because the answer is oftentimes that the problem is complexity in adoption, not the actual price point or the risk of adoption otherwise. The problem is you've got some great people in R&D who came in with their PhDs in material science or in software engineering, and they didn't go to school to take features out of products. They went to school to put features in. Be careful about complexity that's overly inherently focused on causing that problem and pain point in the market. And so when you think about the chasm, the element here really is that we need to figure out a way to find a segment or an application area, group of real normal customers, not the early adopters, who are ready to pounce and ready to buy, and that's not everybody. And so what you'll see is as we ask you this question, and read a little bit more in those first few chapters if you'd like, that fundamentally as you go through this, the goal is to get to what we call the bowling alley. And by the way, we're really clear at Chasm that bowling is not the coolest or the sexiest sport. We know that. You know, rock climbing is cooler, lawn darts, whatever. But the reason we talk about bowling is because bowling is about physics. The physics of, can you knock down the first pin and then actually move to adjacent pins? That's really the goal. And you'll see in a minute that we actually score it based on 9 factors. And Bowling Alley says if you can't identify a target customer, typically a department and a job title with a real workflow problem, then you're not going to cross. And that broad sales motions will fail. Fundamentally, that's the case. Now, Gene Kovacs mentioned earlier that, yes, we will be happy to share the slides. So some of these you don't need to read through in detail now, but I want to give you a hint that says fundamentally, the question about where you are in the adoption curve, be careful, headache slide coming up, is it turns out there's actually 14 adoption stages. Oh my God, Michael, you got to be kidding me. Consultants make everything so complicated. It turns out that if you're in 1A, stop dreaming about crossing the chasm. It's about find a few early adopter pilot tests. If you're in 1C, with 1 being early market, now it's time to cross, et cetera. And so what you'll see in the slide deck is that each one of those areas is actually defined fairly well. What is a 1A, what is a 1B, what is a 1C? I'm going to ask you just for now, to save a little time, to read through just these first 3. You may be sitting in one of those today, not you, but you and your co-competitors. Early market, mid-early market, or late early market. So I'll be quiet for 15 seconds while you read that through, and then we'll continue on. Okay, once again, a short 15 seconds. Notice 1B. 1B is actually still early market. It's the middle of it. It's where visionary customers are getting enthusiasm and asking for executive presentations, demos, or beta tests. Feasibility is being discussed, but it's not yet fully baked. It's not yet fully deployed in any kind of customer, whether a near-term or longer-term customer. And so what you'll see in the slide deck, if you'd like to get it from us, happy to send it to you, you'll see a bifurcation and a stratification of each stage along the way to help you identify much better where you are. So that's step 1. Question 1 is really the where. Question 2 is once we've identified where we are, now the question is which segment do we go after? And although we spend a day and a half in workshops on this or 2 days in helping clients do this, we want to give you kind of the high level view of what that is. And so which market opportunity? You're having debates about that right now. And maybe you just pivoted because of the coronavirus issue to a different segment. It turns out that what you need, I believe, and we believe at Chasm, based on 225 examples, is a more rational way to decide what segments to go after and which ones not. We'll give you a taste of it here. There's more about it in our book as well, and you'll get those, if you want, the electronic version sent to you at no cost, is to how do you identify and score and rank which segment is actually predicated as being the driver for your volume and your chasm crossing in the marketplace. And that segment is based on 9 factors. And it turns out that many of you who have goals of winning in the marketplace, that's the word factors there, it's not very easy to read. We'll try that again, factors, is the 9 factors. Every company out of the 225 that we've either worked with and others that we've studied, have focused and won in a segment before they've won elsewhere. We call that a beachhead segment. Whether it's Apple or Spotify or VMware or LinkedIn or Salesforce or Google, et cetera, every one of them has faced the same problem at some point in their young lives before they became a multi-billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar company. And the problem all of them had was we got 80% of many solutions and 100% of none. And I'm going to invoke the F word again here. It's how do we actually focus on a particular segment and drive it through? If you want the most extreme case, and it's one of the most valuable 3 companies today on the planet, is Amazon. Yep, I think they're testifying today in Congress, but it's a different story. In fact, they got a little bit too powerful, perhaps. Amazon figured out how to cross this chasm back in the early days. Now they're selling hundreds of thousands of products a day. But what was the one segment application they focused on for the first 6 years of their existence? And Jeff Bezos had a list of reasons for why he picked that segment. It wasn't lawn furniture, it wasn't AWS services, and it wasn't diamond rings or shoes, it was books. And you think, oh my gosh, books, that's one of the most boring categories around, and that was the point. Books was the one area that Jeff Bezos identified that said, whether it's a brick and mortar over here, or whether it's an online purchase years ago, people felt that the same Stephen King novel would be the same Stephen King novel. They're not going to worry about the quality. Versus, is that really a plastic shoe or a leather shoe I see online when I'm buying that 10 or 15 years ago? And it turns out that every one of these companies, whether with our help or really just driving through the areas of work and diligence, is they've done this. They've actually figured out that focusing on a particular beachhead segment and then driving their success through that is really the variable that really drives it. And so to pull this together and then get to how do you execute on these 3 questions, there's a fundamental which says there's 9 factors, and each one of those factors is actually, you give it either a 5, and you'll see those in a moment, I'll put them up very quickly, a 5, a 3, or a 1. A 5 is that gives you a strong case for your business. A 3 gives you a neutral, and a 1 is weak. And so the 5, 3, and 1, you'll see it in the tool set that we described here very briefly. It turns out that to pick the right segment, hey, what's a perfect segment? Well, guess what? There is no perfect segment, but if it was, what we'd say is the perfect segment would be a baseline score of 45, right? 9 times 5. You're all good at math. We can make that assumption. But to get to the winning segment, you need a greater than or equal on those 9 variables of a 37 or above. Our data tells us that as soon as you dip below 37, you don't score well enough to actually get traction in the main marketplace. And so those 9 factors, we won't keep those a mystery. You'll read more about them if you want in the book. But fundamentally, you score them. You actually will take a look at looking at those scores for those 9 factors. And those 9 factors, and this is the last page I'll have you read in those 15 seconds, is all the way from factor 1, and this is based on our 225 companies and the analytics around those, to factor 9 that says if we can get those 9 lined up as high scores, and then they vary between large banks and medium-sized insurance companies, or cybersecurity and public healthcare institutions versus in private clinics. Take a look. I'll be quiet for those 15 seconds as you look at this list. This is really the list of 9 that are criteria for a scoring, rating, and ranking the different segments out there. So I'll pause here for 15 seconds as you read that through. And keep in mind, as we're doing this work, fundamentally, the scoring and rating and ranking, it may not actually be that you have to look at 25 segments, although we've had many, as and you'll see in the book, up to 50 or 70 segments. Most companies have 4 or 5 they're looking at, maybe 6. But fundamentally, what it allows you to do is to distinguish between just a big segment and a good segment. And although we won't go into the scoring here, the baseline is basically here, you'll see a 45 in unweighted. And again, in our workshops to go through it, you'll get a more taste of it in the book. You can read that through. But basically, these 9 areas are the 9 that I just had you look at here. And what those really are key indicators. I'll highlight a few right now, is do we have an accessible, well-funded target customer segment? Probably at the department level. The person in charge of the department called what? Called cybersecurity or prevention of of attack within the IT department, or it might be somebody in banking services for another type of product. Do they have a near-term compelling reason to buy? So we've got a set of definitions, and we don't go through all that here. Do we have the feasible whole product? Do we have the right partners and allies? And then perhaps just as importantly as everything else we just described, the ninth one says, if we win in that initial segment, what does that do for us in the follow-on segments? Does it give us that bowling effect of knocking down additional pins? Or do we get stuck in the first segment? Because that's really where the accelerant occurs, the adjacent segments. And that's what this ninth one is actually all about. And so if you turn the page on this and say, what does that really mean? Well, what it really describes is that these scores in the real world, and we've done this about 500 times now, is that a low score, a 32 out of 45, or a 71 out of 100, you see there's weights associated with each one of these, this gives you the hope of maybe later, but do not pursue it now. This is one example. I've anonymized it a little bit for compliance software for large US banks. Now, if you see a high scoring sample of a 38 out of 45 or an 89 out of 100, this gives you a high level of probability, about 80% or more that you're picking the right segment. In this case, it's mid-sized US insurers that they're going after in a venture called Pro Finance Venture. It's an anonymized version. And so everything you see here, and we go through it in our workshop in more detail, is about can we get to the right level of detail in how we actually go to market. And so lastly, what we want to pull together is the question of how do we actually build and drive, once we pick the right segment, the right level of strategy and go-to-market effect. And that's really that final piece there. And so we'll wrap up in a few minutes and then see if there's any questions towards the end. And that's how do we move forward? What I ask of you, if you're a new venture, if you're a company that's scaling right now, or if you're a division or a business in a larger tech company, these 9 are we'll call it the litmus test of whether or not you've got a strategy in place. And what we'd ask you to do, and this is not to make me happy, is to face off and say, does our management team actually have the answers to these questions? What target customer type? What's the compelling reason to buy? Whole product, partners and allies, et cetera. And if we can get this level of detail, even if it's 1 page, it at least gives us some level of granularity. We recommend about a 10-page slide deck that gives you more detail. And by the way, I should mention that the most confusing part of this page is compelling reason to buy. Compelling reason to buy is not why should they buy your product. It's often confused. Compelling reason to buy or switch is why would they want to buy the category. It's not about you. So think of Tesla as a quick example. The compelling reason to buy is not why buy Tesla, it's why buy a high-performing, on-the-street, high-level sports car that's electric. That's the question. And then in position messaging is if I want to buy an electric car that's high performance for use every day with my family and myself, then why buy a Tesla? It's 2 steps, not 1. Most people like to ask in step 2, why buy a Tesla? That's the wrong answer and the wrong question associated with it. It's really, why should I switch from a non or manual system to a AI-based system? And then up here, it's why is the pain high enough in that segment? And then down here, it's why would I buy your product? Very fundamental different. And so if you get this right, it turns out it would look something like this. Again, this is a quick sample. It really says, this is the level of granularity we would expect you to be able to put together. This is not easy. This is a pretty well done one. It's an anonymized version, again, from one of our clients. But if you think of the 225 companies we've worked with, the reality is that if you don't have this, and you can do it on your own, you can do it with our help, however you want to do it, is if you don't have a level of 1 to 10 pages or slides that describe and that you have alignment around, then we don't have alignment as an executive team. And so it turns out that what we're going to put in front of you is this dangerous caution tale. And that says, based on all the companies we work with, it turns out that you need to have, it's not a marketing plan, it's a go-to-market plan that your CEO, marketing, R&D, sales, support, all have to buy into. And if everybody thinks this is a good target segment to go after, except your sales organization, it goes, I got a different idea, then you're not aligned. And so fundamentally, you'll see the example that I just flashed up there for a moment, really takes us through that level of detail. And so fundamentally, like anything in the world, there's projects. And this is the project too. Give yourself some headspace and say within 2 weeks, within a month, within a month and a half, how do we actually go to market? And so let me wrap this up here. We've gone through this very quickly, but wanted to give you a taste for really what is to come and what you can do in taking your really smart team and your amazing products and really have it be in tough times, those 3 questions. And so before I turn it back over to Gene in just a moment for some Q&A, a couple quick things. One is, yes, if you'd like the slides or if you'd like a copy of those first 4 chapters of the book, we can send those to you electronically. Just contact me. It's probably simplest just to send me a message on LinkedIn. You're probably on LinkedIn too. LinkedIn's got about a 98% market share in the US, so that's a pretty good market share. By the way, in other countries, not so good. LinkedIn in Japan, not quite as high a market share, in the single digits actually for real use. But if you want a copy of the slides or you want the electronic version of the first 4 chapters, of course, we'll be happy to send those to you. But let me wrap up and then turn it over to Gene here in a moment with what's really our last slide that says if you can do the due diligence on these 3 questions, the where question, the which question, and the how question, you're going to raise the odds in tough times like this to get much more specific and much more focused. And that's the idea. How do we make sure this happens? Due diligence, smart work by investors, by founders, by the core team you've got in place. And that's really the goal of what we want to get to. So Gene, at that point, I know we're at close to 5 minutes or so to go with questions and so forth.
Yes.
Why don't we turn it over to you at this point to see if there's anything that's coming up on the screen.
Thank you, Michael, so much. That was fabulous. And it was such a good reminder to me of how critical this strategy is, no matter what the size of your company. And thank you also for offering us the first 4 chapters of the book. I actually downloaded a copy of it on Kindle. I think it's something that we should just carry with us everywhere. So we do have a few questions that have come in. The first one is, what is a good methodology for confirming or validating the required minimum viable whole product for a target segment?
Wow, that's a great question. Where this matters deeply is the idea that part of the strategy plan, of course, it's step 3 here on this now very messy slide, whole product, but you'd want to put some more work into it than just a few bullet points here. It turns out, as you think about whole product, and we'll put up a clean version of the slide, I come across many young companies or product launch directors who say, we've decided that this is our whole product. And my answer back in polite terms is, who the hell says that's the whole product? That's your version of it as a vendor. What we want to do is actually look at this from the customer's lens standpoint and say, from their view, is this a whole product or not? And so we advocate that you actually go out, and we've got tools for this to actually get a little bit deeper into it that we won't do now, but we actually go out and say, can you test with real customers in the segment you're pursuing to have them tell you, yes, this is the software, and this is the legacy interface, and this is all the levels of pre-sales, and this is the hardware we need, and to have it be their definition of whole product, not yours. That's the fundamental around what we're talking about here. So what that means is you got to get out of the building, or at the minimum, get on Zoom and talk to people, but not everybody. Talk to customers in the segments that you believe you're actually going after, and avoid doing what we call spray and pray research. Maybe look at 3 segments and doing the whole product diagnostics there. Gene, I think we have time for 1 or 2 other questions. Why don't we take those now?
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer, by the way. Per asked, when a mainstream product is successful, how similar does a new version need to be for a high likelihood of success? Such as if the new version is 60% similar to a successful product, typical works, or 40%, or is there any measurement that you can put on that?
Wow, great. See, I knew we had a really sharp group on the audience here. I'm not just patronizing here. So what he's asking is great. So if you have a product already on Main Street, and it's what we call an incremental innovation, that says small changes that the customer does not see disruptive, we call those plus ones. Those can be actually quite profitable. Plus ones are non-disruptive. What he's getting at is, when do we have to figure out whether a product actually goes back to an earlier stage because it has 3 factors that are causing it to be disruptive? If there's a change in one of these 3, or 2 of these 3, or all 3, one is there a change in behavior required by the customer, going from on-prem to going to cloud, or going from a manual system to an automated AI system? That's a change in behavior. 2, is there a change in process or workflow required? Change in process or workflow. You might not think it's a big deal, but in our med device businesses, we see a lot of that. So it's process, it's workflow, and it's the thinking process as well. And so fundamentally, and an extreme example, and it's always easy to tell this from other companies and not so much from your own, but you take a company like HP, which has had some amazing successes the last, 15 plus years or more. They've sold 400 million printers. That's a lot of ink and a lot of toner, and they're still making money on that, especially in the non-consumer and even more in the industrial packaging area. But now they've come out with 3D printing. And I think we're all clear that that is what we call a renewal strategy. That takes you back to an earlier stage. You have to go here and focus. You can't go broad. Because 3D printing, turns out, is not actually printing. It's actually something else. It's called additive manufacturing. That's an obvious example. But even Oracle, going from on-prem to cloud, has had to make an adjustment to say it's not just an improvement or a plus one. It's a fundamental shift in the customer's behavior and workflow. Doesn't mean bad, but it just means you have to do focus even more so than before.
That's really
So why don't we
good.
take one more question?
Yeah, I have one more. Michael, I know we have a few investors in the audience, and someone typed in, from an investor standpoint, should we expect a founder to have written and validated a 9-point market strategy? And if yes, how detailed should it be?
Wow, great. Okay, yeah. So you know where my bias is on this is that if you look around the room across the LPs or the venture capitalists or the amazing founders or the teams, you need to have a unified strategy in place. And I can't imagine doing that based on a 300-page strategy, because that's not implementable. You can have 200 pages of appendices. I would ask you to at least take a crack, and I would say that the investors should have this expectation that somebody, and it would be the CEO and the founding team or the product launch team in a bigger company, that actually has this both not only written, but actually filled out in a coherent way where it's been tested with customers. So it looks something along the order of this. And I would argue that it should actually be 11 slides. And let's finish with that point, because I think it's an important one. The 11 slides, what are those? The first slide is the summary slide. It's one picture of how we're trying to actually go to market based on the executive team, the founder, et cetera, all being aligned. That's what this needs to look like. And then an additional slide on each one of these elements. The target customer, the compelling reason, et cetera, and then one slide on business objective, that gives you 11. Feel free to have 200 slides of appendices, but don't make an investor or an LP or a venture capital investor or somebody on your team have to read 300 pages or 200 to figure out the strategy. If you can't show them in basically a one-slide overview, and it's not a pitch deck, this is something different. This is how you're going to go to market, and then have the 10 ancillary slides behind it. That gives you a coherence about how we actually move forward and win in our market. So I think that's not asking too much. It could also be to also ask the question about, hey, which segments did you not consider? But the real focus is, and notice here they're talking about specific levels of job title and size of company, et cetera, and not the anybody with a pulse and $50,000 or $5,000 or $500,000, depending on the size of your B2B or B2C budget. So there we are. Gene, let me turn it back over to you and suggest that if people do have a question that we did not cover here, feel free to have them send me either a LinkedIn with a question, or I think you're putting up the slide right now with Angela's name in our office.
That's right.
I'm happy to get back and respond to you.
So I do want to, I want to be respectful of people's time. So we did have a few additional questions that came in, but please do send them to Angela or reach out to Michael. This was, Michael, once again, this was fantastic. So thank you very much for that. Also,
Sure.
We will have a recording available. And if you can't reach out to Angela or Michael, you can go to our website, HBS Angels, and click on the contact us and just put in a note that you want a copy of Michael's slides or you'd like access to the recording. The recording should be available within the next couple of hours. And again, thank you, Michael, and thank you to your team. This has been fantastic. I have many companies myself. I literally wrote down the names of 5 companies that I want to remind them about crossing the chasm and how important it is, especially in the tough economic times we're going through today. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you all for joining us today, and please come back to some of our future webinars.